How could a massive aircraft filled with 239 people simply vanish from the face of the Earth? It might seem impossible in the modern era, but this is exactly what happened. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 on March 8, 2014. There are countless theories, which try to explain the mysterious disappearance. Everything from a remote control hijacking to exploding fruit in the cargo bay have been suggested, but what if the truth is even more disturbing? What if somebody on board Flight 370 was responsible? This is the chilling story of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, and it's a story that might finally help us find the missing plane. It was a clear night at Kuala Lumpur. The capital city of Malaysia. Monsoon season was coming to a close and calmer conditions had arrived in the region. This cam extended to Gate C1 of the satellite terminal of Kuala Lumpur International Airport, where a Boeing 7 operated by Malaysia Airlines was preparing for its journey to Beijing. The aircraft was being fueled and loaded with food cargo and 227 passengers for the 6-hour journey north. As the passengers walked through the jet bridge, none of them could have known that they were about to become a part of the greatest mystery in the history of aviation. Despite the sheer variety of theories surrounding this night, one scenario stands head and shoulders above the rest. This documentary is one of the first tellings of a plausible version of that story. In its music entirety, in the cockpit of Flight 370 were two pilots, both of whom in a matter of days would become the subjects of intense scrutiny. 370, Morning 370 and Level 370. We are ready requesting 3 to Beijing. That's First Officer Fari Abdul Hamid, requesting clearance to Beijing from air traffic control. This was a special flight for the 27-year-old. Flight 370 was his last training flight before being signed off to fly the Boeing Tri-7. He had joined Malaysia Airlines as a cadet pilot 7 years previously in 2007 and had flown Boeing 737s and Airbus A330s for the airline before beginning training on the 777. A few months previously, he had established an excellent performance record for himself in this time and was assessed to be well above average during his progression through the ranks at the airline. In fact, he was doing well enough in his training that the airline considered it safe for him to be paired with just one captain for this fight, rather than the usual 2, and sitting to his left was that captain. 53-year-old Zahari Ahmad Shah. Zahari had joined Malaysia Airlines as a cadet pilot in 1981. In this time, he had built up over 18 years in flying hours. This was an immense amount of experience, and it made him one of the most experienced pilots in the country. Zahari held a senior position at the airline, as well as being responsible for taking hundreds of people around the world as a Tri-7 captain. For the last 7 years, he had also been training pilots to fly the 777 and examining them to decide whether they should be granted their license. Zahari was described by colleagues as jovial, knowledgeable, and a true aviation geek who spent his spare time flying remote control planes, gliding and inviting colleagues to his home to practice procedures on his home flight simulator. But in the scenario which we're now exploring, there was much more to Captain Zahari than would be suggested by his disarming exterior. At just before 12:30 that night, 8 minutes ahead of schedule, the jet bridge was moved, and the massive aircraft was pushed back from the gate. It was now a sealed vessel operating under its own power and untethered to the outside world. On board were 227 passengers, 10 flight attendants, and 49 metric tons of fuel. Some would later speculate that the captain took on an unnecessarily large or even a suspicious amount of fuel, about 30 minutes, more than was required for the distance. But the truth is that Malaysia Airlines mandated all Beijing-bound flights to take on 30 minutes of additional holding fuel, so there is nothing suspicious here. Zahari nudged the 777's throttles forwards and began taxiing out to runway 32, right at Kuala Lumpur. It was procedure at Malaysia Airlines that the captain should taxi the aircraft on the ground, while the first officer handled the radios. Once the plane had reached the runway, the first officer would take over and fly the aircraft to Beijing, with the captain handling the radios as Zahari taxi out to the runway. Passengers settled in and tried to get some sleep. They would soon be in for a rude awakening at 20 minutes to 1. That morning, the aircraft lined up with the runway ahead of it were 4 kilometers of concrete and a dark, open sky. Music 3. Captain Zahari pushed the enormous Rolls-Royce engines to take off thrust and then handed over control to First Officer Ferry as the Trip 7 began thundering down the runway. Within moments, Ferry lifted the massive aircraft into the night sky, and Flight 370 began its journey north. As the plane climbed out, Zahari contacted departure control in Malayan. 370I identify climb, FLLEL. 180, can turn right OK level direct 370, as well as clearing the flight to climb to 18. 000FT. The controller had given the pilots a shortcut, allowing them to go straight to a waypoint further along their route known as Airi. This waypoint Airi is kind of an unusual one. It's one of the few waypoints on the planet which is bordered by a total of 5 different airspaces, namely those of Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Singapore. This fact will take on an eerie significance in the scenario which we're about to explore. The plane continued climbing out as normal, leaving behind the bright orange sea of lights that was Kuala Lumpur. Its flight plan would take it northeast over the Malaysian peninsula and then out over the South China Sea. Before long, the departure controller handed Flight 370 off to Lumpur Radar Control, who was responsible for a higher altitude portion of the country's airspace. 70 contact, 1326, 1326, 37. Zahari dialed this frequency into his radio set and made contact with the new controller. 37, 37, CL Flight Level 2, Level 2 and 370 so far. Everything was going to plan. It was a clear, moonless night. The aircraft was in good condition and there was little other traffic in the vicinity. All the pilots needed to be fully on their way was the final clearance from air traffic control to climb to their cruising altitude, and at about A4 to 1 that morning, that clearance came 370. Climb flight level 33 about 20 minutes after takeoff. Flight 370 had reached this cruising altitude, a flight level 350, or about 35. 01C0FT. When it did, Zahari made a routine report to air traffic control Malayan 370. About 6 minutes later, he made this report again, 37 main level 370. It wasn't necessary for him to make this report a second time, but the fact that he did doesn't really tell us much. Anything from sleepiness to simple forgetfulness could have been responsible up until now. For the passengers' flight, 370 had been about as routine as a flight can get. The flight attendants were making their way through the cabin, with a meal service for those who were still awake. However, most of the passengers were asleep. By this point, what happened next is the subject of much controversy. For this video, we'll apply AAM's razor, which holds that the theory which requires the fewest assumptions is most likely to be the right one. The following account is not definitive, but it is the most consistent with the known facts, and it is supported by some of the world's leading authorities on the subject. At 19 minutes P, when his Flight 370 neared the waypoint of Gary, Malaysian Air Traffic Control told the crew to contact Hoi Minh Air Traffic Control, as they would soon be entering Vietnamese airspace. Milan 370 contact 120. Music night. Much has been made in the media of the radio transmission by the captain. That's because technically a pilot is also supposed to read back the radio frequency they've been assigned, so the controller knows that the pilot has heard them correctly. But pilots who know in airspace, well, like Zahari did, sometimes don't read back the frequency. So there is truly nothing unusual about Zahari simply saying goodnight as he switched over to Hoi Minh. What is strange, however, is what happened next. And here is where our scenario begins. Just seconds after saying goodnight to Lumber Control, Captain Zahari asked First Officer Feek to go back into the cabin and get them both a cup of coffee. They had 5 hours of night flying ahead of them. A shot of caffeine wouldn't go amiss. The first officer dutifully headed back to the galley and closed the cockpit door. Behind him, normally the cabin crew would bring the coffee. But Fari was not about to question the man who held his career in his hands. Now sitting alone in the warm cocoon of the cockpit was a man who had been rehearsing for this night for over a month. Every step, every movement had been planned with the utmost precision. And it had to be because Zahari was trying to pull off the impossible. He would now try to make one of the world's largest, most modern jets vanish from the face of the earth, safely locked behind his bulletproof cockpit door, ironically designed to keep would-be hijackers out. He could now carry out this plan without interruption. He reached back into his flight bag behind his seat, pulled out a warm sweater, and put it on. He would be needing it in a moment. Zahari had chosen this exact moment to make the plane disappear, because for these precious few minutes, nobody on the ground was expecting to hear from the aircraft Malaysian controllers had handed them off to Vietnam, and Vietnamese controllers were busy with the aircraft which were already in their airspace. As far as they were concerned, it would be a few minutes before Flight 370 checked in. So for these precious few moments, Flight 370 was in limbo. Nobody in the world was watching. Zahari's first step in making the plane vanish was to make it disappear from radar. To do this, he needed to turn off the plane's transponder, but he wasn't going to do this straight away if he did it before. He reached ARI. Malaysian Air Traffic Control might notice him dropping off their radar screens. If he waited until he had reached the waypoint, he would truly be out of their jurisdiction, as the first officer obliviously fixed a coffee in the forward galley or whatever counted for coffee on an aircraft. Zahari fixed his eyes on Agari as it inched ever closer at 8 m a minute, when the active waypoint at the top right of this screen here changed from Agari to Bod, the next waypoint en route. That would be his trigger to turn off the transponder, and after a few moments it came. The aircraft reached ARI and began turning towards its next waypoint. At exactly that moment, Zahari switched off the transponder. Flight 370 disappeared from air traffic control screens in Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia. Step 1 was complete, but unbeknown to Zahari. He had left a clue, the first of a few clues he would leave over the coming hours, and a clue that ultimately took investigators years to uncover. The transponder of the Boeing 777 has basically 3 settings fully off, where no information is transmitted to air traffic control: altitude, off where only the plane's position, but not its altitude, is transmitted; ITED to air traffic control, and fully on where its position, altitude, and a few other parameters are transmitted for a split second. As Zahari twisted the dial towards the fully off position, it passed through the alt-off position, unbeknownst to him for that, telling split second as the dial passed through alt-off stations on the ground, received the plane's position while its altitude read 0. This is not what would happen if the plane had experienced a massive electrical failure leading to the loss of the transponder, among other systems. If that had happened, all of the data would have been lost at once. This brief partial loss of transponder data suggests that somebody in the cockpit was turning this dial manually to the off position, but this clue wouldn't be discovered for a long time as far as Zahari was concerned. Step 1 of his plan had been completed successfully. From that moment, nobody on the ground knew where Flight 370 was. The plane continued turning towards Bod, the next waypoint on its route, except there was still a problem. By disabling the transponder, Zahari had made the plane invisible to air traffic controllers, but Malaysia Airlines still knew that the plane was in the air. That's because the TRI-7 is equipped with a CARS, or aircraft communications, addressing and reporting system. This feeds status reports from the plane to the airline via a satellite communication system called SATCOM. These status reports include information about the plane's fuel on board, its maintenance status, and even its position along its flight route. Every 30 minutes, Zahari knew that he couldn't truly disappear as long as AC CARS was still functioning, so he needed to disable it. But disabling AC CARS was not going to be as easy as turning off the transponder. If he turned a CARS off the usual way, it would send a message to the ground saying that it was being powered down. Not a great prospect if your mission is to disappear without a trace. To truly vanish without leaving a trace, the captain would need to do something far more drastic. He would need to essentially pull the plug right out of the socket so that ACARS would go dark immediately without sending this telltale log-off message. To do this, Zahari reached up to the overhead panel and, using 2 fingers, turned off both engines' electrical generators. This instantly cut off the electrical supply to a whole host of aircraft systems, including the satellite communication system, which ACARS users to send and receive its messages now. There was no way for anyone on the ground to receive information from the plane. Just to be sure, he then went through the menu on his flight management computer and deselected the two ways by which ACARS can communicate with the ground SATCOM and VHF radio. Now, even if SATCOM came back on AC, cars wouldn't be able to talk to the ground. As far as the outside world was concerned, it was at this spot over the South China Sea where MH370 had vanished. Disabling the SATCOM also had another benefit which would be absolutely essential for the next step of the captain's plan. It meant that the satellite phone in the passenger cabin and the text message facility in the passengers' in-flight entertainment systems would no longer work. All lines of communication between Flight 370 and the outside world had been severed to make assurance doubly sure. Zahari then turned off the plane's external lights. Now Flight 370 was fully invisible. All of this happened in the space of less than a minute, but these were only the first steps in Zahari's grand plan. He had successfully hidden the aircraft from the people on the ground. But behind him, 238 people were expecting to be flown to Beijing. The first officer was making coffee, and he would be returning to the cockpit very shortly to carry out his full plan. Zahari would somehow need to incapacitate every single person on the aircraft, and to that end he had at his disposal a rather unconventional weapon, air, or more specifically, thin air at 35 ft. There is only enough air to keep a human meaningfully conscious for about 45 seconds, but the air inside a passenger aircraft is pressurized. It's compacted like the gas in a soft drink can. If the captain could somehow open a hole in his plane, most of this air would come rushing out. Luckily for him, he could open a hole on the underside of the plane. There were two valves aptly named outflow valves. By opening them, he could vent all of this condensed air out into the atmosphere. The captain readied himself. He reached into the panel on his left-hand side, pulled out his oxygen mask, placed it over his head, and started the flow of oxygen. Now that he had an oxygen supply, he swung his right hand up to the overhead panel and prevented the engines from bringing new air into the cabin. Then he pressed a switch which turned the aircraft's cabin pressurization from automatic to manual. Now he controlled the amount of air inside the aircraft's cabin. He had in his hands the air supply, the very lifeblood of all 238 people behind him. Once he carried out this next step, there would be no turning back. The next few seconds were the most critical in his entire plan. Just as he had rehearsed, Zahari moved his fingers down to the two cabin outflow valve switches and pushed them to the open position on the belly of the aircraft. The two valves opened. There was a tremendous whoo inside the cabin as the air came rushing out. Any passengers who had been sleeping were startled awake by the noise and the change in air pressure. Their ears popped, and the oxygen masks dropped automatically from the ceiling. The sudden expansion of the air inside the cabin made it significantly colder, adding to the passenger shock. But before the bewildered passengers even had a chance to put their masks on, the captain yanked the plane violently to the left in the forward galley. The first officer was slammed to the sidewall by the dramatic turn. He only had seconds to find an oxygen mask in the pandemonium before he would fall unconscious. The captain was holding the plane in a turn so steep that the automated bank angle warning sounded. The plane was at the edge of its capabilities, straining to stay aloft as the captain turned harder and harder. But this wasn't done for dramatic effect. Zahari needed this turn to be tight. He was right beside Tayi airspace, and the last thing he wanted was to burst into an airspace which he hadn't been clear to enter, because even though he had disabled the transponder, there was still one way that he could be detected: primary radar. Primary radar is the most basic kind of radar, and it works on the very simple principle of reflectant. A radar dish on the ground sends out a signal which bounces off any objects in the air, including planes and flocks of birds, and is reflected back to the radar dish, because it just works by bouncing radio waves off an aircraft's skin. There is no way for a pilot to avoid being detected by primary radar, but at the same time, because it's such a simple system, all it can tell is where an object is. It can't tell what it is or how high it is. If Thailand's military spotted an unidentified target, Infringing upon their airspace, they could well scramble fighter jets to investigate who the mystery intruder was. So as Zahari rolled rings level just over 2 minutes after beginning his turn, he checked his position on his navigation display to his relief. He had just about managed to avoid Thai Airspace Flight 370, was now headed in the opposite direction back towards Malaysia. The first part of Zahari's mission was complete, but a massive challenge still lay ahead of him. He would now have to cross back over the Malaysian peninsula without being intercepted by the Malaysian or Thai Air Force, and he would have to do this without having his plan spoiled by the 238 people behind him. In the main cabin, the passengers were startled and confused. They had put on their oxygen masks and were listening intently to the cabin crew's instructions. The cabin crew told them that there had been a rapid decompression and that they would be descending to a breathable altitude soon apart. From how cold the cabin had gotten and the fact that the oxygen mass had dropped, the situation appeared to be under control. Noise levels in the cabin were normal, and now that the sharp turn was finished, the plane was more or less flying steadily. But First Officer Fick knew that this situation was anything but under control. Nowhere in any depressurization checklist does it say that the pilot should turn the plane around. Their first priority after donning their oxygen masks is to descend to an altitude where the air is breathable. Whatever was going on up front, it had to be very strange during the steep turn. Fari had scrambled to sit at one of the cabin crew stations in the forward galley, and he had grabbed an oxygen mask there. Now he was ready to return to the cockpit to help the captain with the emergency, but secure on the other side of the impenetrable cockpit door. The captain had other plans. Passenger oxygen masks only provide about 20 minutes of oxygen. The reason for that is that this gives enough time for the pilots to descend to a safe altitude where the air is breathable. This usually takes about 10 minutes. None of the passengers of crew knew it yet, but they would not be descending to a breathable altitude. Their time was running out. First Officer Fick approached the cabin in one at the forward left door. His heart pounding over his shoulder was slung one of the plane's portable oxygen bottles which he had grabbed from its compartment. He had attached the flexible plastic mask to his face and was breathing heavily from it as he brought his fingers to the handset. There were 15 of these oxygen bottles distributed throughout the cabin, one for each of the flight attendants on a maximum. Crew flight there were just 10 cabin crew on board Flight 370, so there was more than enough for each of them. And unlike the passenger oxygen masks, these bottles had 44 minutes of oxygen, more than the crew could possibly need in any conceivable emergency. But this emergency had never been conceived of. Fee was the only person on board breathing from a portable oxygen bottle. The flight attendants had followed their training and had quickly sat down at one of the spare passenger seats or at a flight attendant station and grabbed the 20-minute drop-down mask there. But Freak's situation was different. He was badly needed in the cockpit, and a portable oxygen bottle was the only way to stay conscious while he tried to regain entry. He picked up the handset, dialed the code to call the cockpit door, and put the receiver to his ear. In the cockpit, a message appeared on the captain's central display cabin call. If Zahari wanted to open the door, all he had to do was rotate the switch on the center pedestal from the auto position to the unlock position. The door would unlock. The light on the entry keypad outside, the door would turn green and Feek would be able to push it open. Fi waited and watched as the light on the entry keypad continued glowing red. It should only have taken a second for the captain to unlock the door. Why was he not doing this? The first officer figured that he must have been very busy handling whatever emergency this was. He waited for a few moments and then dialed the cockpit again. The cabin call message appeared on the captain's display, and again he ignored it. This was terrifying. The aircraft had depressurized and it wasn't descending. Something was going seriously wrong up front. In the cockpit on the other side of the door, Zahari fixed his eyes ahead out his windscreen and onto the orange lights of the seaside town of Kota Baru. This was his entry point for his journey back across his home country, and it was perfect. For this mission, his plan was to skirt the border between Thai airspace and Malayan airspace this way, When the Malaysian military saw the plane on radar, they would assume that it was being handled by Thai controllers, and likewise when the Thai military saw the plane, they would assume that it was being handled by Malaysian controllers, and Zahari figured even if they did realize that it was Malaysia Flight 370, after seeing it turn back at Ari, they may think that it was making an emergency return to an airport, perhaps Pang's airport where it appeared to be heading. If this was the case, the flight would be the concern of the civilian controllers who were surely dealing with the plane. But in reality, Malaysian civilian controllers had handed the plane off to Hoi Minh in Vietnam. They weren't even thinking about it anymore. Flight 370 was in limbo. Meanwhile, locked out of the cockpit, First Officer Fe could tell that despite the depressurization, the plane had still not begun. To descend, he then had a terrible thought. What if the reason the door wasn't opening was that the captain had become incapacitated by the rapid decompression? This would be odd, though after all, donning the oxygen masks was the first item on the checklist, which is completed even before the descent is initiated. And what's more, Captain Zahari regularly taught this scenario to pilots in the airline's flight simulators. He was more qualified than almost anybody to handle such an emergency. How? Could he simply forget to put on his oxygen mask? But there was no time for Freak to work this out. He needed to get back inside the cockpit, and for that, he had one last option. Cockpit door keypads don't just accept one code as well as the normal code. There is a special code for the rare event in which the pilots are incapacitated, and the cabin crew need to gain access with this code. The door opens automatically if the pilots haven't responded after 30 seconds. But of course, this emergency code could easily be used by hijackers to gain entry to the cockpit. So to prevent this, in the cockpit, pilots have the option of turning the door switch to the deny position within 30 seconds of the code being entered. This clever logic allows crews to gain entry to the cockpit in case of a pilot incapacitation, but also gives flight crew the to deny entry to hijackers. The first officer hurried over to the keypad and punched in the emergency code. A loud buzzer sounded in the cockpit. If the captain was incapacitated, the door would automatically open for Phi in just 30 seconds. Phi waited anxiously. 10 seconds passed, then 20. But those final seconds came and went, and the keypad light remained red. A horrible, sinking feeling came over the first officer. He entered the code once again, this time more carefully, and he waited, counting down the seconds using his watch, and yet again after 30 seconds the light remained red. This could only mean one thing. On the other side of the cockpit door, the captain had heard the buzzer and had turned the switch to deny. The captain checked his watch. The time was 32 minutes 1 in the morning. 12 minutes since he had turned his 777 back on itself. About 5 minutes. From now the passengers' oxygen masks would begin to run out. When they did, all 227 of them would become hypoxic. The 10 flight attendants were in much the same boat, still strapped in and waiting for the signal from the captain that they were free to walk about the cabin. The effects of hypoxia are much like the effects of alcohol, with some people becoming euphoric and giddy, others becoming angry, and others still becoming contented and relaxed. Contrary to what many people think, you don't suffocate in a decompression. There is simply a dimming of awareness until the proverbial lights go out. Ironically, the very loss of mental faculties which occurs in hypoxia prevents the realization that it is even happening in the cockpit. Zahari made a minor adjustment to stay on course as he carefully scanned the skies around him. He was now back over land, zooming across peninsular Malaysia. He had been flying in these skies for decades, day and night, and he knew the lay of the land so well that he could easily identify the various towns en route as he flew overhead. He knew that at his current speed, he would be able to cross the peninsula in about 20 minutes as he flew. He had his radio tuned to the Kuala Lumpur air traffic control frequency. He could hear the controller talking to the other planes as normal. At least for now was business as usual in Malaysia at Hoi Minh. However, controllers had noticed something odd. The Malaysia Airlines flight from Kuala Lumpur, Flight 370, hadn't made contact. This wasn't overly concerning. Sometimes it takes a few minutes before pilots get in touch. But what was unusual was that the flight wasn't even showing up on radar, despite having been handed over by Lumper Control almost 20 minutes. Earlier, the controller tried contacting the flight over the radio, but Hoi Min was far from Zahari mind at this point, as controllers there counted up the minutes since he was supposed to have made contact. He was counting down the minutes until the passengers and crew would lose consciousness. As for his own oxygen supply, he was at no risk of running out. His supply came from 2 large tanks underneath the cockpit, which had enough oxygen to last 2 pilots 13 hours, or 1 pilot 27 hours. These tanks are topped up a few times each year, and luckily for Zahari, or perhaps more than just luckily, this oxygen supply had been topped up that very evening just before the plane had departed Kuala Lumpur. Take a look at this. It's a scanned copy of the actual tech log from Flight 370. This is one of the last pieces of paper generated by the flight before it left Kuala Lumpur. The tech log is the booklet where engineers and pilots note down any faults with the aircraft, and whether they need fixing before the plane goes on its next flight. There are 2 things which stick out in this document. First, under defect description, the engineer wrote Neil and Neil notes. In other words, no maintenance needed. He also crossed out these fields to show that nothing was needed. But then sometime later that evening, an engineer did make an entry crew oxygen system replenished to 1800 psi, sometime between when the plane arrived at Kuala Lumpur earlier in the day and when it left again that night. As MH370, somebody decided that the pilot's oxygen needed to be topped up. Whether it was Zahari has never been determined. The first officer was beginning to panic. No matter how many times he entered the code, the light remained red. He began to bang his oxygen mask against the cockpit door in a desperate bid to get the captain's attention. Hoi Min Air Traffic Control was growing concerned. Flight 370 had still not turned up on radar, and it hadn't answered any of their calls. The controller had tried asking other planes in the area to make radio contact with the plane, including on the international distress frequency. These aircraft had reached out, but were met with nothing but silence after repeated efforts. To call the missing aircraft, the controller at Hoi Min telephoned the controller at Kuala Lumpur and told him that he had not been able to make radar contact with Flight 370. He asked whether the flight had turned back to Kuala Lumpur, but the Malaysian controller told him that it hadn't. Fears were now beginning to grow, that something terrible had happened at the flight. The controller at Kuala Lumpur began calling out to Flight 370 on the radio in case it had returned to his airspace. Zahari was listening out but remained silent for the first time. That night, he had confirmation that the ground knew his plane was missing. The time was 1:41 in the morning, 20 minutes after the flight had disappeared from radar. Controllers are supposed to report when an aircraft takes more than 5 minutes to make contact. Clearly, the air traffic control system was not at its best tonight, and as Zahari watched out his window, he hoped that the Malaysian military was just as sleepy, because right at that moment his plane was a blip on their primary radar screens racing southwest across the peninsula. Zahari could see the lights of Penang on the horizon. Once there, he would carry out the next step of his plan. Around this time, the passenger oxygen masks began to run out gradually. The low chatter which had pervaded the aircraft began to fade in a matter of minutes. All 227 passengers would be unconscious, and unless pressurization was restored, not long after that, they would suffer irreversible brain damage from oxygen deprivation, and then death. Flight 370 looked like any other plane as it whispered along high above the Malaysian countryside, but it was now becoming a flying mosum for all but one of its occupants, music. First Officer Fee was growing increasingly desperate. None of his attempts to get back into the cockpit had worked. He had to try something different. He knew that at this altitude his mobile phone would have no signal. However, at one of the cabin crew stations there was a satellite phone. Maybe he figured if he could get through to the airline, somebody might be able to help him. Ferry began making his way back through the cabin. The clock was ticking. Ferry still had about 20 minutes of oxygen in his tank. But as he walked back through the cabin, he was beginning to feel lightheaded. Even though his mask was providing 100% oxygen, it was not designed to be used at high altitude for prolonged periods of time. By comparison, the captain was wearing a full face mask with a tight seal, and which was specifically designed to deliver oxygen at a positive pressure. This meant that it forced oxygen into his lungs at a rate which ensured that he received as much of it as he needed, and with 2.6 hours of oxygen remaining, he was in no rush to repressurize the plane. By now he had calculated all of the passengers, and most if not all of the crew had lost consciousness on his lower central monitor. He could see the first officer through the CCTV slowly walking away from the door back into the main cabin now. At the other end of the Malaysian peninsula, Zahari had reached the next important step in his plan. Ahead of him lay the Indonesian island of Sumatra. As far as Ari was concerned, this was an impenetrable wall. There were primary radar installations up and down the island, and there was no guarantee that the Indonesians would be as blase about an unidentified aircraft as the Malaysians had been. If he wanted to escape, he had to avoid Indonesian airspace altogether. So for the next part of his plan, he would need to turn to the right and fly up the strait to Malaya. This way he would remain inside Malaysian aerospace, all the way until he went out of range of primary radar far below him. On his right-hand side was the island of Penang. He had grown up in this island, and now he would fly over it one last time. Hari twisted the heading select knob on the autopilot, and the aircraft began a slow, sweeping turn to the right. As it did, the first officer held his mobile phone against the passenger window and tried desperately to make a call. His attempts to use the onboard satellite phone had proved fruitless. He didn't know it, but the SATCOM, the satellite communication system, had been disabled by the captain. Frey could see the distinctive island of Penang beneath him, along with its airport, which he had flown to many times. This was the first time since leaving the cockpit that he had a clear idea of where the aircraft was normally. Mobile phones cannot get a signal at the speeds and altitudes that airliners fly at, but with the plane in a turn, its distance to the cell tower on Penang remained roughly constant. So for a few short seconds, the first officer's mobile phone and iPhone 5 connected to the ground station at Penang, but far from being able to make a call. All that freak got was a brief fleeting signal bar at the top of his screen. For a few seconds, the cell phone tower registered a signal hit, indicating that the phone was on, but nothing more. When the signal bar disappeared, Fee knew that he was truly out of options. Barely able to stand up from hypoxia and exhaustion, he made his way back to the cockpit door, still in complete control. The captain rolled out on a northwest heading. Some have suggested that this turnaround Penang was Zahari bidding a final farewell to his hometown. However, this is unlikely for one thing. The turn began after the plane had passed the island, so it wasn't really a turn around the island. And besides, the turn was too shallow for the captain to have been able to see the island anyway. Sentimentality had no place in the cockpit of Flight 370. What mattered was the mission, and the mission was far from over. It had been just about 35 minutes since Ari had depressurized the plane and turned it back over the Malaysian peninsula. He had managed to get across the peninsula without being intercepted by fighter jets, but he still had a significant challenge ahead of him, because Malaysia Airlines had just found out that something was amiss with Flight 370 at Lumpur Radar Control, the supervisor on duty telephone. Malaysia Airlines Dispatch Center, telling them that Hoi Min had been unable to contact Flight 370 or see it on radar. The dispatcher at Malaysia Airlines checked the airline's online flight tracking system to locate the flight on the map. It showed Flight 370 to be in Cambodian airspace. Of course, in reality, Flight 370 was nowhere near Cambodia. What the dispatcher did not know was that this flight tracking system didn't use live information from the aircraft to update its position. Rather, it simply projected its last known position out into the future, since the plane's last known position was over the South China Sea, heading northeast. That's where the flight tracker showed it to be, so far as Malaysia Airlines was concerned, and now air traffic control authorities too. That's where Flight 370 was. They had no idea that at that very moment the aircraft was hundreds of kilometers to the southwest in Malaysian airspace, speeding up the Strait of Malaya. But it still wasn't good news to the airline that one of its flights hadn't checked in with air traffic control. The dispatcher at Malaysia Airlines sent an ACARS text message to the cockpit printer, asking the pilots to contact Hoi Min immediately. But this message didn't make it to the cockpit of Flight 370. The captain had stopped the AC cars from being able to communicate with the outside world. Right after he had removed power from the SATCOM, he was intent on ensuring that not a single clue about the aircraft's status or position made it back to air traffic control or Malaysia Airlines, however. Even with the ACARS disabled, there was still one big thorn in Zahari's side. He knew that at Lan Airport in the Malaysian state of Kedah, there was a primary radar station. He also knew that the range of this radar was 200 nautical miles. For every second he spent inside the range of this radar, he risked being discovered and intercepted by fighter jets because he couldn't avoid this radar. His strategy for this part of the mission was to blend. And even as at night plenty of commercial aircraft fly up and down the Strait of Malha, on their way between Kuala Lumpur and Europe in the Middle East, to anybody looking at the radar, that night Flight 370 would appear as just one more dot moving serenely up the Strait of Malha. An eerie silence now filled the passenger cabin of the 777. It had been almost an hour since the plane was depressurized and all of the passengers were either unconscious or dead. The first officer and any CN crew who had used portable oxygen bottles with a 44-minute supply had slipped into unconsciousness too, at an altitude of 35,000 ft. Even 100% oxygen delivered through a portable oxygen bottle is not enough to stay meaningfully conscious. The only person alive and functioning was the one up in the cockpit. But the situation which he had created was now beginning to have unexpected side effects for his plane. And these had nothing to do with his oxygen supply back at Agari. When the sea captain had cut power to the plane's two main electrical generators, the aircraft's computers had diverted the limited remaining electrical power to only the plane's most essential systems. But now, almost an hour after this had happened, the plane had begun throwing up warnings, saying that the computer room underneath the cockpit, known as the NA Bay, was getting too hot. Its cooling fans were one of the things which had lost power when the main electrical generators were depowered. So Harry didn't fancy finding out what would happen if the computers which powered his cockpit screens and the aircraft's massively complicated systems overheated according to his checklists. The very least that would happen was that his screens would start going blank without them. He would not be able to complete his mission. He had to restore power to the cooling fans. Flight 370 was nearing the edge of Lan's primary radar. After this, Zahari would be free, totally unseen by the outside world. He decided that once he was outside of radar range, he would be safe. Only then would he restore full electrical functionality to a the plane. Meanwhile, air traffic controllers in Malaysia and Vietnam were becoming increasingly confused. Malaysia Airlines operations had told Lumpur Radar Control that Flight 370 was in Cambodian airspace, but as Vietnamese controllers confirmed, Flight 370 was never supposed to enter Cambodian airspace. It was supposed to fly over Vietnam. And besides, Cambodian controllers couldn't see Flight 370 on the radar. So where was the flight? Was it over Cambodia or Vietnam, or was it in the air? At all, in truth, all parties involved were being duped by the software Malaysia Airlines used to track flights, which merely projected the plane's last known position out into the future. In the cockpit of Flight 370, Zahari could see on his CCTV display that the first officer was laying slumped against the cockpit door. The one person who stood a chance at thwarting his plans had been eliminated just in case there was anybody left. He picked up the microphone and made a call on the intercom, asking for somebody to come and help him in the cockpit. He watched the display carefully. Nobody came at just after 22 that night. Flight 370 slipped off the radar at Lan. Now truly the flight had gone dark. Over 200 people on board were dead, but at this point, an hour after it had turned back at Airy, barely a dozen people in the world even knew that the plane was missing. Zahari had been listening into air traffic control on his radio set, and there were no signs of fighter jets being scrambled to intercept his plane. As it would turn out, military radar operators wouldn't even notice his flight on their screens until they played back a recording of them the next day, safely beyond the reach of radar and securing the knowledge that he was now the only one left. Alive on board, Zahari was now able to restore full electrical power to the aircraft. He reached up to the overhead panel and re-energized both the left and right electrical buses. A host of onboard systems sprung back to life as the plane reconfigured. Electrically, the familiar hum of the fans below the cockpit resumed, and they began cooling the hot computers. Zahari had made it. He had done the impossible and made a bone. 777 disappear into the night, never to be seen again. It would be morning before anybody began searching for the aircraft, and they would begin by searching the only logical place, the South China Sea, where the flight had disappeared from secondary radar. The sensible conclusion for rescuers to draw, given that the plane had disappeared suddenly and without sending it a stress signal, would be that a bomb or catastrophic structural failure had downed the aircraft. Zahari knew that in the days and weeks that followed, it was possible that investigators would review tape recordings of primary radar and see that the plane had turned back at Agari and then turned again at Penang and flown up the Strait of Malha. But he knew that this is where the trail would end if authorities were smart. Search and rescue operations would focus on the Andaman Sea and the Bay of Bengal. And this, in Zahari's mind, was the beauty of his plan, because now, out of radar coverage, he would pull off his final trick. Once he had flown past the island of Sumatra, he would turn to the south and take his 777 deep into the southern Indian Ocean. Nobody could possibly know that he had taken this turn, and even if they somehow did, they wouldn't be able to find him. The Indian Ocean is enormous, and with over 5 and 1 to hours of fuel still on board, he could go deep into the middle of it. As far as Zahari was concerned, this plan was foolproof, except it wasn't. Zahari didn't know it, but the SATCOM, which had been rebooted when he restored power to the main electrical generators, wasn't just a passive system. It wasn't like the radio antenna on board the aircraft, which simply received radio signals and sent them only on request when he restored full electrical power to the aircraft at 25 minutes past 2 that morning. A component of the SATCOM, the Satellite Data Unit, or SDU, rebooted, and when it did, it sent a message to a satellite high above the Indian Ocean saying as much. This satellite was operated by a company called Inmarsat, which stands for International Maritime Satellite. The plan's SDU told the satellite, or more accurately told the ground station in Perth, Australia, which the satellite acted as a conduit for that. It wanted to log on to the satellite network. This log-on request was proof that the plane was still in the air, or at least that it was still intact. And what's more, every hour the ground station in Perth would send a message to the plane, which the plane would respond to, confirming that it was still on the network. What this meant was that Zahari was dead wrong in his assumption that he had completely vanished. He continued up the Strait of Malacca, oblivious that he was carrying with him an enormous liability, but he couldn't be blamed for thinking that the SATCOM wouldn't give much away other than the fact that the plane was still flying. After all, this log-on request contained no information from the satellite's point of view. It just got a message from a Malaysia Airlines plane asking to log on to the network. This message didn't say where the plane was or anything else of the sort. However, it did contain one piece of information which, in a week's time, would shock the world. An engineer at Inmarsat would take a look at this log-on request. The cover of darkness, and having completely duped the authorities, Zahari would now make his final turn. South he twisted the heading select knob to the left, and the 777, Sahar's unwitting accomplice, obliged, completely oblivious to the mission. It was party two. As Zahari turned south, he could picture the headlines which would appear in the newspapers over the coming days. He could envisage the countless theories which would be put forward to explain the mystery. He knew that as long as the wreckage was never discovered, there would always be a shadow of doubt as to what had caused the plane's disappearance. Some would say that what happened on this night was a tragic accident, that some combination of electrical failure, rapid decompression, and pilot incapacitation led to Flight 370 going missing. But these theories, which we will call accident scenarios, all have massive flaws. If there had been an electrical failure big enough to incapacitate the pilots, why did the satellite data unit come back online an hour after it was disabled? and stay working for hours afterwards. Usually when electrical systems fail, they stay failed, and if the pilots were so incapacitated that they couldn't get the aircraft to descend and get back to an airport, why were they still conscious enough 30 minutes after the emergency began to turn at Penang, and then more than 40 minutes after that, to turn again out over the open ocean? What's more, why did they turn at such inopportune places? Why was every turn timed perfectly, so as to avoid detection by air traffic controllers, civilian and military? Anybody who believes the disappearance of Flight 370 was an accident also has to reckon with the fact that the aircraft problem started exactly when it reached Agari, the transfer of control point between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace. If an accident had caused Flight 370 to go missing, then it would seem that chance itself had framed the pilots for the disappearance. Others would say that a hijacking best explains the aircraft's disappearance. But if that were the case, this would need to have been the most technically sophisticated and yet ultimately the most fruitless hijacking of all time. These hijackers had clearly done their research. They knew the surrounding aerospace inside out, judging by their ability to evade detection by the military radar for over an hour, and they had intimate knowledge of how to fly and how to hide a Boeing 7. They apparently knew exactly how and exactly when to turn off, not just the transponder, but the SATCOM and the ACARS too. These were no rookies, and yet despite all of this planning and skill, these hypothetical hijackers appear to possess a strange lack of conviction. An hour after disabling the SATCOM, they were kind enough to turn it back on. They were also considerate enough not to crash into any buildings, and they were selfless enough not to make any demands of any authorities on the ground. In fact, if a terror group was responsible for the plane's disappearance, it was apparently humble enough not to claim responsibility after the fact, because 9 years after the disappearance, such a claim of responsibility is yet to be forthcoming. This is not even to touch on some of the more outlandish theories that the plane had been hijacked by the CIA via remote control, or that it had been sucked into a black hole, two theories of approximately equivalent likelihood, and that's only considering the evidence we've looked at so far. Those who believe this was an accident still have to contend with one more fact, and it's perhaps the most disturbing fact of all, as Zahari headed south over the Indian Ocean. This strange series of events was oddly familiar to him. That's because just over a month before this night, he had practiced this journey on his home flight simulator. Hi everyone. This is a YouTube video that I've made on the evening of February 2nd, 2014. Zahari had taken a simulated high Boeing 7 up to cruising altitude and flown it along the Strait of Malacca. There was nothing particularly unusual about this. Malaysia Airlines had plenty of flights which went up the Strait of Malacca, and like many pilots, Zahari sometimes practiced flights on his home computer. What was unusual was what he did next. Once Zahari had reached the end of the Malacca Strait, he turned the plane to the south, and then he used the flight simulator's map function to drag it deep into the southern Indian Ocean. From there, he set the fuel quantity to 0 and began gliding the plane first from an altitude of about 37,000 ft, and then from 4,000 ft. If this simulator route was a mere coincidence, then once again, we would have to conclude that chance itself had it out for Captain Zahari on this night. Zahari undid his seatbelt and reclined in his seat. He gazed out into the darkness in front of him for thousands of miles. There lay nothing but dark, deep ocean. Some of the deepest ocean in the world, in fact, and the most isolated too. Almost no shipping lanes traversed the southern Indian Ocean. It was now deep into the night on March 8, 2014, but this date hadn't been Zahari's first choice. On February 3rd, when he used his flight simulator to fly to the southern Indian Ocean, he had set the date on the simulator as February 21st. Fans of coincidence are now in for another treat, because on February 21st, Zahari had been scheduled to fly Flight 370 to Beijing. That date was his first choice the day before the flight. On February 20th, Zahari deleted his flight simulator from his home computer and disconnected the drive it had been stored on. But February 21st came and went, and Zahari operated Flight 370 to Beijing. As normal, the over 200 people on that plane had had a narrow escape. The passengers on the March 8th flight had not been. So lucky an hour since Malaysia Airlines had called Flight 370 over the SATCOM phone, the ground station in Perth initiated another handshake with the aircraft via satellite. The second arc was formed a few minutes earlier. Malaysia Airlines had finally told Lumper Control that the position information they'd been providing them with for Flight 370 had actually been based on projected position, and not on actual position. Their focus on Cambodia had been a total red herring at this point. Controllers considered that the plane might be on its flight plan route, but that it had experienced a communications failure of some sort. They began contacting Chinese air traffic controllers, as by this point the aircraft should have been in their airspace. If the flight was running on time, it should arrive in Beijing in just under 3 hours in the cockpit of Flight 370 hundreds of miles to the south. Zahari twisted the altitude selector on the autopilot and put the plane in a climb. The higher he flew, the less fuel he would use, and the deeper into the ocean he could go. He knew that if he crashed far enough into the middle of the ocean, the crash site would never be found. Any wreckage which floated on the surface would take months, even years, to wash up on the shores of Africa and Australia. Perhaps investigators would piece together a rough picture of what happened, but without any hard evidence, his family and friends would be spared the shame of knowing with certainty what he did there would always be a shadow of doubt as to what had happened. The plane out over the middle of the southern Indian Ocean. Zahari was now perhaps the most isolated person on the planet from miles in every direction. There was not a single human life. No islands, no planes, and no boats at now. Even though his aircraft still had hours of fuel on board, there was no longer any reason for him to be part of this mission. He had carried out his tasks just as he had practiced. For weeks, with the turn to the south complete, and his autopilot keeping the plane on course to the middle of the southern Indian Ocean, his presence on board was now superfluous. He would now slip into the night for the second time that night. Zahari opened the outflow valves, only this time he didn't day his oxygen mask within seconds. He was breathing thin air at 40. 00 FT, his thinking slowed. His senses dulled, and moments later, the lights went out. Flight 370 was now a ghost plane. Whispering out over the dark open ocean as the hours went by, the satellite data unit on board continued its hourly handshakes with the ground station in Perth. It was early morning in Beijing, and controllers were hoping to see a Malaysian Trip 7 on final approach to the runway. Its scheduled time of arrival was 6:30 a.m., but this time came and went, and still no plane appeared on the horizon. Families waiting for the arrival of their loved ones were told that the fight was delayed. Meanwhile, search and rescue efforts began in the South China Sea, with no contact for hours. Rescuers were fearing the worst. Would they come face to face with the shattered wreckage of a fully loaded Trip 7? They had no idea as they searched quite how absurd the situation truly was. At that very moment, the aircraft was still in the air. Only it was thousands of miles to the south, and everybody on board was already dead. Malaysia Airlines Operations Center made another SATCOM call to the cockpit of Flight 370. Incredibly, this was only the second call they made to the aircraft over the entire flight, but just like it had the first time, the phone rang out. This time, Zahari wasn't even there to see it for the airline. There was no avoiding it. Flight 370 was now officially missing. Just before 7:30 that morning, Malaysia Airlines issued a press statement and announcing that the flight was missing and that they were working with search and rescue authorities to find the plane. The world now knew that a Malaysian Airlines flight had crashed. What nobody knew, and what nobody could possibly have known, was that the aircraft was still very much in the air, still making its way south on autopilot as the sun rose over the southern Indian Ocean. An hour after the last satellite phone call to the plane, the ground station in Perth initiated another handshake with the aircraft, creating the sixth ring, and therefore the sixth arc. Early morning rays of sun now streamed in the windows of the vacant plane, the sole witness of the silent horror which had unfolded hours beforehand. The scene on board was still like a photograph, capturing a moment from hours ago, and frozen in time ever since. Nothing on board had moved since that moment. But this eerie serenity would soon be shattered. All of the pent-up violence, which had been obscured by Zahari modus operandi, would now be unleashed all at once. Shortly after 8 a.m. that morning, The right-hand engine ran out of fuel to compensate. The left-hand engine went to full power. With this, the Trip 7 began a gentle turn to the right. A few minutes later, the left-hand engine flamed out, the autopilot and auto-throttle disconnected. The cockpit instruments went dark, deprived of power and electricity. Flight 370 was now at the whim of aerodynamics. The plane began slowing down and descending. It was the beginning of the end. Except the aircraft had a final trick up its sleeve in the Tri-7. Some fuel is reserved for the auxiliary power unit, the APU, in case both engines flame out. The APU is a small gas turbine engine in the aircraft's tail. It doesn't produce any thrust, but it does provide the plane with limited electrical and hydraulic power in the case of a double-engine failure. It starts automatically and provides enough power to ensure that the aircraft remains controllable. But without the pilots at the controls, this was no good. Except on this morning. This feature of the Boeing 7 would leave an incredible clue for investigators. The APU automatically started up, drawing from the small amount of fuel still remaining in the tanks. When it was up and running, electrical power was restored to the aircraft, bringing some of the instruments and systems back online. One of the systems to which power was restored was the satellite data unit. It sent a signal to the satellite above the Indian Ocean, just like the one it had sent almost 6 hours earlier, requesting to log on to the satellite network. This signal created a final ring and therefore a final arc, the now infamous 7 event arc. If the APU had not been restarted automatically, this signal would never have been sent, and we would never know where the plane had run out of fuel. This signal was different than the other ones which had been sent out over the Indian Ocean, in that it was not a handshake initiated by the ground station in Perth, but a log-on request initiated by the aircraft itself. Zahari could have had no idea that this arc would be created, pretty much confirming the plane's location in its final minutes. But this isn't where the story ends, because as it turned out, there was one more thing which could be gleaned from the signals sent to the satellite by the SATCOM. As the satellite data unit of Flight 370 powered up, multiple aircraft systems took turns logging onto the satellite network, each sending a signal within a few minutes of the other. When engineers analyzed the frequency of these signals from the 7th arc, they found something odd. They were at a lower frequency than all of the previous signals. After eliminating various possibilities, what remained was a clear answer. When Flight 370 sent these signals to the satellite, it was descending away from the satellite, stretching out the radio wave as it was being transmitted. This caused the satellite to receive a lower frequency signal. But investigators didn't stop there by precisely comparing the normal frequency of the signals which the aircraft had sent previously with the frequency of the signals received from the plane on the 7th arc. Investigators could determine roughly how fast the plane was descending. When it sent these signals at 19 minutes past 8 and 29 seconds, Flight 370 was descending at a relatively normal rate of about 4 ft per minute. This is steeper than a plane would typically descend at, but it was within the ballpark for a normal flight. However, just 8 seconds later, when it sent another signal, the aircraft was screaming towards the ocean at an incredible rate of approximately 15 ft per minute. This was about 10 times the normal descent rate, and well beyond anything an aircraft, like the 777, would glide at such an incredible rate of descent, is consistent with the aircraft being in a steep turn, rolling onto its side as it fell towards the ocean as the plane neared supersonic speeds. Some of the control surfaces on the wing, including the flapper on, began to flutter before detaching from the wing. Less than 2 minutes later, Flight 370 plunged into the ocean at 21 minutes 8 and 7 seconds. One more signal should have been sent from the plane to the satellite. The signal never came. Most of the aircraft was shattered upon impact, with the debris sinking for miles before settling scattered on the seabed. Below, however, hundreds of pieces began floating over the coming months and years. These pieces washed up thousands of miles away, on the shores of Madagascar, South Africa, Reunion, and Tanzania. Among other countries, over 30 pieces of wreckage have been discovered to date, both from the interior and exterior of the aircraft. A flapper on from the right wing. the plastic frame of an in-flight entertainment screen from the back of a passenger seat, a section of wall paneling from the forward cabin. Many of these 30 pieces have been recovered by one man, Blah Gibson, which, aside from being a testament to his perseverance and dedication, indicates that there are hundreds or even thousands of pieces still waiting to be discovered along the shorelines of Africa and nearby islands. If only governments were willing to look, these pieces are the only hard physical evidence showing that the plane went down in the southern Indian Ocean, and therefore that it flew south after passing Sumatra, and not north, as some people had believed in the years since the disappearance search teams carried out extensive underwater searches along the 7th Arc, mapping over 120 square kilometers of seabed. But so far, the plane's wreckage has not been found today. Almost 10 years since the aircraft went missing. All searches have been called off pending new and credible information on the plane's final resting place, but there is still one final turn in the story of Flight 370. Let's say that at some future date, maybe decades from now, we do find the wreckage. Would this bring us any closer to understanding why the plane crashed? The black boxes, if they still contain data, after what might turn out to be decades underwater, may not have any recordings of the flight's final hours. That's because if the captain was intent on hiding the aircraft and on hiding his own culpability, he would simply have pulled circuit breakers for the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorders shortly after asking the first officer to leave the cockpit. Nothing in the wreckage would point towards his involvement. Of course, such a finding as blank black boxes would be evidence in itself. But as always with MH370, the question lies in how this evidence should be interpreted. Those who favor accident scenarios would use this as further evidence that a massive electrical failure befell the aircraft, while those who think that Zahari crashed the plane would use this as evidence that he was responsible. When something as seemingly impossible as the disappearance of a modern airliner happens, we naturally want the cause to be as big as the event itself. But in all likelihood, this was not a grand conspiracy by the CIA or the Russians involving spies or classified technology, nor is it likely that it was the result of a series of highly improbable accidents. Rather, all the evidence points towards a single simple explanation: deliberate premeditated action by a skilled pilot, intent on accomplishing an unthinkable but entirely achievable goal to make an aircraft disappear. This video is not a definitive account of what happened on Flight 370. Experts disagree on a number of important aspects of the flight, including whether there were any turns after the plane went south, and whether Zahari was dead at the end as depicted in this video, or whether he glided his Tri-7 over 100 kilometers from the point of fuel exhaustion and ditched it onto the surface of the ocean. These important questions have not been resolved, and they have significant implications for where the search efforts are directed. For this reason, unless new evidence is released by the Malaysian government, it's quite possible that the most fruitful line of inquiry will be to investigate the possible motives and beliefs of Zahari Ahmad Shah. He is overwhelmingly likely to be the cause of the plane's disappearance, and therefore understanding his mind may hold the key to finding Flight 370. Where would he have directed the plane? Would he have tried to glide it at the end? It's an uncomfortable truth that as long as humans can fly passenger jets, humans can crash passenger jets. No amount of tracking technology or cockpit procedures can prevent this. The rarity of such events is the only solace for those of us who fly today. But this is of little help to the families of those who stepped on board 5370 on March 7, 2014. This video is dedicated to those families and to their L1s on board Flight 370.